All right, before you guys jump into chapter 2, I want to point out a couple of things, or at least clarify a couple of concepts about how homeostasis relates to adaptation. And I'm going to use the metaphor of the hamburger. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so homeostasis and steady state are conditions where you have an equilibrium between the physiological supply of the body and the demand for that supply, right? So let's say that the body, when you're exercising, your muscles are demanding oxygen and blood. The physiological supply would be blood flow, oxygen delivery, right? Homeostasis is when that supply and demand are met at rest. You have this balance or equilibrium. When you do moderate intensity exercise, you have an increased physiological demand for all of these things like oxygen, and the body is able to increase its supply. You breathe harder, you pump more blood and deliver more oxygen to the muscle. And eventually you reach this condition called steady state, or a new equilibrium, an elevated equilibrium. Now, how does this relate to adaptation? To understand that, you gotta understand a couple of things about something that I care deeply about. In-N-Out Burger. I love hamburgers. They're delicious. I made some tonight on the grill for my kids. In-N-Out Burger, I grew up in Las Vegas. We had it, and we would go all the time with my friends. If we ever had anything to celebrate, we'd go to In-N-Out Burger, get an awesome double-double animal style, and we'd celebrate, get that delicious pink lemonade, and we loved it, right? So I came here to BYU as a college student, along with all my Vegas friends, and we missed In-N-Out Burger, so did all the Californians. There was no In-N-Out Burger here at the time. And all we did was talk about it. We'd tell all our friends, In-N-Out's the best, these burgers are amazing. And so what happened was that there was this big demand for In-N-Out Burger, and there was no supply. In-N-Out Burger was just kind of like this mythical thing that people who were not from Vegas or not from California, they just kind of had heard about it, right? So there was no supply. The demand was so great that I remember as a college student signing an online petition saying, we want In-N-Out Burger here in Provo. Everybody signed it, thousands of people, right? And so what happens when you have this imbalance between supply and demand, right? Everybody wanted these burgers, but they couldn't get them. So the wise entrepreneurs at In-N-Out Burger built one here in Orem, right? And suddenly we're at a homeostasis again, where we have a matching between the demand for these hamburgers, and now there's this structure, the building, to supply the burgers to meet that demand. Now, word spread that In-N-Out Burger was really good and everybody started to like it. And so what happens? You've seen it. The lines outside of In-N-Out Burger can get ridiculously long. This picture here is not from Utah, but it illustrates the point. Most of the time in Utah, we have the lines are mostly on the drive-thru, especially right now with COVID, right? So they built that one restaurant, or maybe one or two, but the lines are still out the door. If you go at rush hour, like dinner time, you have to wait in line for like an hour to get this. This is what we would call unsteady state, where the supply that they have is unable to meet the demand for a prolonged period of time. If they have these mad rushes every night, which they do, where there's lines out the door to get these burgers, what would you do next if you're an entrepreneur? If you're not able to meet the demand with your current supply, you build more restaurants. And if we're talking about if your heart can't pump enough blood to meet the demand for the blood in the muscle, what happens? Your heart adapts and it learns to pump more blood. You get a greater supply. And so now with this presence of an unsteady state, a really hard to meet demand, you get an increase in supply. Now, how does this apply to exercise? Or what do these things look like in exercise? So homeostasis is a balance between supply and demand at rest, and it usually manifests with constant or relatively constant variables. So here's a plot of cardiac output. That's how much blood your heart pumps every minute, measured at rest and then during exercise. So on the horizontal or x-axis, we have time, resting and exercise, and then cardiac output on the y. And I collected these data a couple years ago on a 70-year-old cyclist. So it's pretty impressive. See the 70-year-old guy cranking it out on a bike. So at rest, you can see his heart is pumping relatively the same amount of blood over time. It doesn't change all that much. But then when he starts to exercise, so that would be homeostasis, right? A balance or constant conditions in an unstressed condition. But when he starts to exercise, we've suddenly increased the demand. He starts pedaling on that bike and the muscles are begging for more blood, more oxygen. And so the heart now has to pump more blood. And so cardiac output goes up and up and up. And it's adjusting. It's increasing its production level to meet the demand. And eventually, in his case, he was able to meet the demand and reach a steady state so that the demand for cardiac output and blood was met by the heart. And we have this equilibrium that manifests as a plateau or a steady state, okay? If the demand was higher, let's say that he was exercising at a higher intensity. This was only like 60% of his max exercise capacity. If he was exercising at a higher intensity, the cardiac output would have gone up like this. And then right about here, he would have fatigued, right? What do you notice about this? In this condition where we're stressing the heart beyond what it normally can do, we don't see a steady state. We don't see a plateau. We don't see that equilibrium. That would be called unsteady state exercise or non-steady state. Later you'll learn it's really called, more specifically, we can call it severe or extreme intensity exercise. So we saw that with that In-N-Out burger example, in the presence of increased demand, they increase the supply. Now, if you do that with your muscles, if you start exercising, you start lifting weights, let's say you lift 45 pounds, do 45-pound bicep curls every day, you're gonna get an increase in supply of muscle, right? But if you don't increase the demand on that muscle, as soon as the muscle adjusts to where it can reach a steady state relatively easy at that 45 pounds, there's no incentive to adapt. So if you want to keep getting stronger, faster, better, smarter, we can apply this spiritually, physically, professionally, whatever it is. If you want to keep getting better, you have to keep overloading, progressive overload. Just doing the same thing all the time is not going to make you grow. You have to add intensity or added stress. And we'll learn in a couple of days how you can increase this overload. There's lots of different things you can manipulate. But if you want further progression, you gotta keep increasing the demand. As soon as your supply is able to meet the demand, you gotta increase the demand again, tip that balance so that you give an incentive for added growth. Now we call this concept hormesis. Hormesis, it refers to this idea that a little bit of stress frequently can cause beneficial adaptations. Now, let's say in your heart, when you do higher intensity exercise, you cause the heart to demand a lot of oxygen. And if you get to really high intensity exercise, it gets to the point where the heart is demanding more oxygen in the heart muscle, the core and the myocardium, the heart is demanding more oxygen than can be supplied, right? And it puts stress on that. It's starving for oxygen. And as you do it for exercise, it's not that big of a deal, right? It's a short intermittent time. But that same scenario in heart failure causes you to eventually die, right? So this small stress, the amount of oxygen deprivation or starvation that you get in very intense exercise, in the muscles or in the heart, with exercise, it's just a very small dose of the same thing that you have if you're having a heart attack, or if you're having peripheral arterial disease and you can't get enough blood and oxygen to the muscle to meet the demand, right? So a small dose of stress elicits adaptation. Too much stress, if you go over here to too much stress, now it's detrimental, right? That's where you go from having exercise causing a demand for oxygen to have an intermittent demand for oxygen, to having like a clogged artery, causing a chronic demand for oxygen where you just can't get enough oxygen there, right? So that causes bad things. But if you have, the same goes if you have too little stress. If you don't have enough stress in your life, the balance tips back the other way. Let's say you have more supply than you're using. You have more muscle than you need. You're not lifting, putting any stress on the muscle. What happens? The muscle atrophies and you lose it. All right, so this concept of hormesis applies not just to exercise and strength training or aerobic training, but it will apply to basically everything in your life. If you want growth, you need a good amount of stress. Not too much, but just right, okay? So let's also highlight this other concept of reversibility. We talked about progression, that if you want to progress or get better, you need to tip the balance to where demand outweighs supply every once in a while. But what happens if you go the other way? What if your supply outweighs your demand? The perfect example of this, in my opinion, is Sonic, right? So Sonic's popped up all over Las Vegas in the 90s, and we were all stoked for him, right? Like, cool, we can get a hamburger without leaving our car. We can get this awesome drink. And it didn't take people long to realize that their hamburgers are terrible. At least they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. I haven't had them for a long time. They have decent soda and ice cream, but the hamburgers, not so good, especially in comparison to In-N-Out Burger. So they built up, in the 90s, they built up all these Sonics around Las Vegas and around Utah. And then people stopped going because the food wasn't good. So what happened is they had this huge supply, all these Sonics all over the place, and very low demand for them. So what do you think happens? To reach equilibrium, they close a bunch of Sonics. Now the supply and the demand are balanced. You reduce your supply to meet your lower demand. Your muscles will do the same thing. Your heart can even do the same thing. If you reduce the demand that you're placing on the systems of your body, the structural supply of it will adapt. And in the case of muscles, they'll atrophy, you'll lose muscle mass and muscle strength because you don't need it, right? Why is your body going to waste energy maintaining muscle or other things that it doesn't need? Your body is extremely economical, right? So that's where we'll end it for now. This whole balance or equilibrium between supply and demand, this really underpins what causes adaptation, positive or negative adaptation. So go ahead and read chapter 2 with this in mind, and then we'll meet in class in a day or two.